So thank you, Lauren, for having this conversation today about urban foraging and freegans and raccoons, garbage, food waste, and we'll talk about race and class and intersectionality. So much to talk about. I'm drawing on two of your texts for this conversation, your other conversation in Messy Eating, and also your article, Getting Their Hands Dirty, Raccoons, Freegans, and Urban Trash. So to start with your conversation in the recent volume, Messy Eating, there you discussed your frustration as a student that speciesism wasn't included in feminist intersectionality in your gender studies classes. And that's still largely my experience working in the field of women's and gender studies. So I was wondering if, in your experience, things have changed much in this regard within the discipline of gender studies.
Yeah, it's a difficult question to answer because I don't feel I have my finger on the pulse of gender studies in the way that I used to. I did my master's and my PhD in environmental studies. And that was basically after I reluctantly left women's studies, which would now be called gender studies at the University of Manitoba. Primarily, I was leaving gender studies because of its really profound anthropocentrism. And that was at the end of the 1990s. And then I catapulted into environmental studies and then was hit with a new set of limitations and also possibilities. I mean, I think environmental thought gave me a great deal. And I was very fortunate to work with primarily feminists, ecologists, and environmentalists at the Faculty of Environmental Studies at York University. So I think I have a bit of a skewed understanding of gender studies because the people that I've really been attracted to are people who are making connections between environmental justice and violence against women and gendered issues from an environmental studies perspective. However, when I was in my undergraduate program, that there were early scholars like Josephine Donovan and Carol Adams and people like that who were drawing connections between the oppression of women and the oppression of animals. And I think doing really important groundbreaking work. And I think that that kind of interest and the willingness to bring animals into the conversation and to have conversations more broadly about the environment that might include animals and gender, I think that is increasing. It doesn't seem quite as stigmatized anymore. When I say that environmental studies had its limitations, it's because it comes with its own varied but diverse set of prejudices about domesticated animals in particular. And I hope that's beginning to change, but there's a kind of privileging of the wild and wilderness and those sorts of social constructions over the domesticated, and the domesticated becomes kind of the shadow other in environmental studies for very understandable reasons. The environmental movement was trying to press against industrial capitalism and those sorts of things in North America. And similarly, I think that the women's movement has understandably had anthropocentrism at its forefront because women have been animalized. So even though I'd like to see the conversation extend just beyond talking about women per se, I think that those feminists in the 1990s in particular, and even in the 1980s, 1970s, people who were calling themselves ecofeminists or animal ecofeminists at the time, were drawing really important connections between violence against women and violence against animals. And I think that the conversation is broadening. But you probably have a better sense of this than I do. I don't feel like I'm quite as tuned in. So that's my best snapshot. I think that there is more openness, but I haven't been enmeshed in that field. I have located myself elsewhere because environmental studies really at the time was the place that you could do more non-anthropocentric scholarship about connections between human oppression and animal oppression.
Turning to an exemplary intersectional article of yours, Getting Their Hands Dirty, I was hoping that we could talk a little bit about food waste, because as you discussed, reducing our waste as raccoons and freegans do should be a real environmental goal, not so-called green consumerism, where we're encouraged to purchase environmental products rather than reduce our consumption. So you give the example of energy efficient light bulbs in your article, and we could also think of cleaning products marketed as green, even when they're sold in plastic containers, for example. So I recently read Amanda Little's book, The Fate of Food, and she has a chapter on food waste called Stop the Rot. And here she writes, it's a fairly lengthy quotation: 52 million tons of food are sent to US garbage dumps annually, and another 10 million are discarded or left to rot on farms, according to the environmental group Natural Resources Defense Council. Put another way, Americans waste enough food to fill a 90,000 seat stadium every day, and that's about 25% more per capita than we were wasting in the 1970s. Most of the food waste in the United States, about 35%, is generated by households. The average American throws out more than a pound of food a day, some 400 pounds per year each. Restaurants and retailers are close behind, generating another third of it. The value of the food wasted in America each year has been estimated at between $162 billion and $218 billion. Wasting food also means wasting all the water, energy, agricultural chemicals, labor, and other resources we put into growing, processing, packaging, distributing, washing, and refrigerating it. The nonprofit group ReFed estimates that food waste consumes 21% of landfill volume in the United States. Add to that the methane problem: only 5% of food waste in America gets composted into soil fertilizer using a controlled process in which bacteria and heat decompose food scraps into rich plant nutrients. The other 95% of food waste goes to landfill and rots in an uncontrolled way, emitting methane, a potent greenhouse gas. If food waste around the world was a country, it would rank third behind China and the US in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. So I'd expect Canada is somewhere close to the US in terms of per capita food waste. And since a lot of wasted food is animal products, this also means that a lot of animals are being raised in torturous conditions and killed in the food industry just to end up in landfills. So I wondered if you might comment on the situation of food waste in light of your work on class, racial, and species politics of urban scavenging. And in particular, given the situation with food waste, it seems that we should be heroicizing dumpster divers and taking raccoons as our role models, but instead we're stigmatizing and villainizing them, as you show in your article.
Yeah, it takes a moment just to recover from that quote that you read. I mean, I read it prior to the interview, but it's just devastating. It's so extreme, that kind of waste, and that the suffering is multiplied through ecological, animal, human conditions. I was looking up some research for this interview, and according to the City of Toronto website, they're citing the National Zero Waste Council's research on household waste in Canada, and they note that 2.2 million tons of edible food is wasted each year, costing Canadians in excess of 17 billion, which is also pretty extraordinary. So I definitely do think it's translatable to Canadian context for sure. Looking back on the freeganism paper, one of the things that strikes me looking at this earlier work that I did is that I think I was really trying to have some kind of meditation on intersections between ideas about civility and capitalism. And people like Claire Jean Kim, who I've referenced extensively in my work and in the other interview that we did, I think she gives us a language, building on people like Manisha Deka and Carrie Wolf, to think about how people who are not considered subjects at the center of Western thought, who are considered fully human and fully civilized, they're cast into sort of fluid spheres that are beyond that center of subjectivity. And I didn't quite have the language for it at the time, but people like Manisha Deka, people like Carrie Wolf, they talk about the animalization of different human groups and the animalization of animals as well. And so anybody who isn't at this center of subjectivity, who is, white, able-bodied, male, etc., is cast into these sort of increasingly abject spheres of peripheralization. And that is, to me, such an illuminating lens for some of the issues that I was getting at in the freeganism paper, which is that you have groups of people who are not participating in what counts as a civilized way of procuring food, which is to consume it through capitalist means and to participate in these ways. And I was struck at the time that I was writing that article about the shared discourses used to demonize both urban scavengers and that are humans, and then animals who are urban scavengers, and that there was this intertwining of discourses to demonize both groups. And I think that using that framework that I just described, that we can see that those subjects, both humans and non-humans, are in those peripheralized categories of not being seen as fully civilized subjects. And so they're cast into this more property status or object status. And I didn't really center in on the language of colonialism at the time, but I would reframe it now as really as a project of colonialism to cast certain subjects within those spheres or in those roles outside of being considered full subjects. And then once they're not full subjects, you are able to do all sorts of things to not only disparage those groups, but to disparage those ways of being in the world or those practices that those groups are engaging. So those would be some initial thoughts that I have sort of to update or to further illuminate some of those themes that I was trying to tease out at the time. And I was really compelled, and I still am compelled by people who are trying to disrupt the kind of common sense ways of participating in our food systems. So, one of the things that strikes me from years of teaching is that a lot of students come into my classrooms dehistoricizing capitalism, that this is the way that it's always been, and this is the way that it always will be. And it's so important to realize that this way of procuring food and streamlining it through these profit generating industries is only one way of distributing food, and it's incredibly inequitable and to me just devastating to see that we have so much food that people and animals should be able to consume without having to pay for, and nonetheless we have people starving, and all the environmental consequences of industrial agriculture are well documented.
Your description in the article of the racial and class politics of freeganism, or who has the privilege to voluntarily engage in urban foraging without facing an undue amount of stigmatism or stigmatization, is really interesting and compelling. As I think about your article, I keep remembering a time when I left my apartment building and the door of the building would automatically lock behind me when I went out to take out my garbage. And I had my keys in my hand and the bag of garbage I wanted to throw into that dumpster. And when I tossed the bag of garbage in the dumpster, I also tossed my keys in. Anyway, and the dumpster was full and the keys fell between everything all the way to the bottom. So I spent about 20, 30 minutes, literally digging to the very bottom of this dumpster on a busy city street and lots of people looking at me. But so I thought about that a lot when reading your article, because you talk about how it is a kind of white middle class privilege to be able to quote unquote dumpster dive or urban forage, because it was embarrassing to me, but it wasn't unsafe, or I wasn't reinforcing any stigmas about people like me. You talk about how people of color will find it much more difficult or not safe to
Mhm.
engage in this kind of urban foraging. But that whole conversation made me think about similar discussions about racial and class politics of veganism, because there's always similar kinds of claims that veganism is something that only middle class white people can do or can afford to do. So it's kind of similar to what you're saying, that it's middle class white people who are most able to engage in urban foraging. But I'm much more convinced by your argument about urban scavenging or freeganism than about those similar arguments about veganism. And I wondered if you could say anything on that topic.
Yeah, I mean, it's such a tangle. There's so many different threads that we could trace. It really depends on context when you're talking about veganism and urban scavenging. So, one of the things that strikes me in both of these conversations about sort of the racial implications for both sets of practices is that it really depends on where you are and your context about how privileged it is or it isn't. So, when I was doing interviews for Animal Voices, the radio show, I interviewed people who had started a website called blackvegetarians.org. And when I said that the vegan movement was very white and the animal rights movement was very white, at the time, this was several years ago, they kind of laughed at me. This was the McCorder sisters. And they said, it depends on where you are. There's these legacies of Black vegetarian societies in the United States that have very long roots. And they found that, yes, in certain urban centers, the animal movements and practicing veganism, the visibility of it is primarily white. But that wasn't true in certain contexts that they were in. And so one of the things that I think is difficult is to try to have a conversation about context. And, I've interviewed people like Margaret Robinson, who's Mi'kmaq, who's a scholar who talks about how her understanding of veganism and her practice of veganism in her early days was much more grounded in like foods that were cheap. For her, it was cheaper to be vegan than to eat an omnivore diet. And so that's just one example of like how context really does matter. If we're going to talk about Indigenous people in Northern contexts, they might not have the same access. Or if we're going to talk about urban centers in the United States where people can only access food through convenience stores, that's going to change whether or not veganism is accessible or not. One of the things that sometimes concerns me in the vegan conversations is that there's so much work done by BIPOC folks to talk about how they're drawing on their own traditions to reclaim veganism within their own contexts, and that sometimes that work gets erased. And I think even well-meaning people, when they're trying to talk about whiteness and how it's functioning in the animal movements, can over critique in the sense that they start erasing that there's been these longstanding traditions and many voices of people showing that they are able to be vegan, or that this comes out of their cultural context. And that there needs to be ways that we can talk about the inequalities that capitalism and colonialism have produced that has made vegan food in some ways inaccessible in certain contexts or many contexts to people, without also erasing all the vital work that BIPOC folks have done to show that veganism in its like multifaceted, multi-faced form comes out of roots that cannot just be traced to whiteness. That seems like a really important intervention in the conversations that we're having right now with the rise of intersectionality kind of making its way more, I don't necessarily know if more centrally to the animal movements, but they're gaining greater traction to have intersectional conversations. So that's the vegan piece, which I know is a kind of a tangle to talk about. And then the urban scavenging, again, I wonder about representation and visibility. So we might say that this looks like a white practice. And I think that the stakes are different for white people who are jumping into dumpsters or having that kind of surveillance of their practices. And at the same time, not erasing that there are many people who are freegans or who are doing urban scavenging who are people of color, and that they continue to do this work of food redistribution in both small scale and large scale. And that even though the stakes are higher for them, given white supremacy and the prison industrial complex and policing, that there still is this vital work. One of the things that I always find a bit of a struggle is to name white supremacy and wanting to talk about it and then not erase those voices that are often marginalized within these conversations of people engaging in these kinds of practices who have been trying to talk about their own cultural interpretations or geographical interpretations of how to do this work. So I'm thinking here of people today that I find really inspiring, like Alexis Nicole, who her handle on Instagram is Black Forager. And she's doing something that I would consider freeganism. I don't think she uses that language quite often, but she's pointing to the possibilities of wild foraging and to connect with various different cultural roots that are outside of white supremacist capitalist ways of engaging with food.
My last question is about those other urban foragers you talk about in your article, the raccoons. Sue Donaldson and Will Kimlicka have discussed the fact that as a society, we have an idea that animals should either be domesticated or wild. Those are our two categories, or that the only animals who should be living among us are domesticated animals. There shouldn't be stray animals, there shouldn't be feral animals, there shouldn't be pest animals in our human communities, in our homes. So any animal who is neither wild and living in the wild nor owned by someone is categorized as a problem animal and can be exterminated. And there are almost no legal protections for those liminal animals. So there's a certain amount of respect that we have for wild animals living in the wild and a certain amount of concern for domesticated animals, although obviously not enough given the rates at which we encroach on wild animal habitats and kill domesticated animals. But still, it seems to be that it's the liminal animals who are the most vulnerable of all, in the sense that many people just think they shouldn't exist, that they defy the acceptable categories of wild or domesticated animals. So those animals are actually missituated often in the wild category in the sense that they actually have adapted so much to living in human settlements that they couldn't survive in the wild. And they're seen as out of place in these areas where humans live, but we've taken over their habitats and or they're living there because we brought them there. So raccoons are one such animal. So I wondered what you think of Donaldson and Kimlicka's idea of seeing domesticated animals as citizens and wild animal species as sovereign states and liminal animals such as raccoons as denizens. And what would denizen status mean for the raccoons of Toronto that you talk about?
It's a really interesting question. Some of my entry point into thinking about the work of Donaldson and Kimlicka is through Billy Ray Belcourt's critiques. Given those critiques, I don't necessarily subscribe personally to the citizenship model that they employ, although I think it's really interesting. I guess my starting point would be different, but I do think those categories are one entry point into conversation about agency. And so when we're talking about denizen status, perhaps it can be about recognizing as a starting point that animals also have a rightful claim to land. And you pointed out in your question that they've been in these habitats for a long time. Within the dominant culture, we've reversed this, that they're invading our spaces. So the notion of denizen, I think, gives more grounding to their right, if we want to use that language, to be in that place. One of the things that strikes me about raccoons and the way that they're moving through urban environments is that they are incredibly intelligent and that they have kind of beat us at our own game. You know, we have created these centers where there's concentrations of foods. We've put that food out for them to access, and they've been thriving in that context. You know, Toronto is considered the raccoon capital of North America, or maybe the world even. And so it's really unfortunate, I think, and part of the reason I was inspired to write that article is because I was sad that they've been so demonized for doing something that is completely understandable, that they would take these opportunities to flourish the way that they have in places like Toronto. If there could be language, either through Donaldson and Kimlicka or others, to bring them back into place as rightful subjects, as also having an experience of an urban environment where for the most part, human beings are the ones who have created these conditions where they are doing so well. I think that's a total reversal of the much more objectified pest and vermin discourses that get associated with them, which I think really lose sight of those historical contexts that brought us to this place in the first instance. So I'm excited about the possibility of considering them denizens. I think that language shift or philosophical shift could be useful. I'm thinking too about the work of Sykes and Gurdjieff, who have talked about the medieval animal trials, and that this is this ongoing legacy that we have where animals who disrupt crops or they're seen as invaders in some way into human civilization, that they are prosecuted and they are demonized. And it's a way of kind of rewriting or correcting the natural order. These authors talk about that. And I feel like that's part of what was happening when people were talking about we need to run over the raccoons, or this kind of making raccoons as a killable category, as Donna Haraway would talk about, that they're absolutely seen as killable and that the violence that's done to them is justifiable. And indeed, it isn't even rendered as violence at all. One of the things that I'm excited about with Will and Sue's work is the possibility that they could at least be considered more subjects. Anything that's going to kind of flesh out the subjectivity of urban animals as having an experience, perspective, their own understandings of the world, their own mobilities through urban environments, I think is a positive thing, because really it was reaching such a vicious peak when I was writing that article that I was surprised at how brazen people were at speaking about violence against the raccoons, and that this could be not only socially acceptable within the dominant culture, but kind of a point of mockery, or like kind of that you would do it as kind of a joke, killing raccoons, or you would go out there with your shovel or whatever. So I think we do need new frameworks to talk about these liminal animals and to bring them into some understanding of their own subjectivity and having lives that matter, and that also that kind of contextual analysis that shows us that they are here and they are thriving because of food systems that we have created that are based on inequalities of humans, the domesticated animals, and the environment more generally. And so, raccoons and urban foragers are in some ways a kind of understandable outgrowth of these processes that they didn't create, but they are benefiting from, and that they could, in our imagination, become teachers to us about different ways of participating in food systems. And if we want to label them denizens or anything that will resituate them as having a claim to this habitat, I think is a positive step.